So today's discussion is Asian Americans, Arts, and Activism. And we're honored to have with us CurtisChin, the award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker, and Bino Realuyo, the acclaimed novelist. They are two of the co-founders of the Asian American Writers Workshop, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary. Now, Curtis and Bino are going to say more, but I do want to briefly lay out the context for today's conversation. So it was 30 years ago in 1991 that our nation and our world were embroiled in a grave global health crisis, namely AIDS. The prevalence of hate against so many groups, including Asians, and seemingly entrenched divisiveness. So this might sound familiar to what we're experiencing today. Yet the Asian American Writers Workshop moved us forward with so much success. So what can we learn from that experience that will help us move forward today? Well, first I have the honor of introducing our two guests. So CurtisChin is a graduate of the creative program at the University of Michigan. He's received awards from ABC Disney Television, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and many more. Curtis has screened his films, Vincent Who, and tested with over 600 entities in 16 countries, including the White House, Amnesty International, and the government of Norway. Curtis is a co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop. He's writing a memoir with a great title, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. And he's completing a short documentary on Corky Lee, the activist and acclaimed photographer of Asian America, whom we lost to COVID-19. Bino Realuyo wrote his first novel, The Umbrella Country, published in 1999, while he was in the Asian American Writers Workshop. It was at the workshop that Bino solidified his passion for poetry and political activism, so pivotal in his life that over the past 3 decades, it's become an outlook, a practice, a tool to pave roads. Poems from Bino's completed manuscript, hashtag The Rebel Sonnets, can be found in the recent issues of the Harvard Review, the Georgia Review, the Common, the North American Review, and the Missouri Review, among others. Bino recently received his second New York Foundation for the Arts Grant for Fiction and his second Queen's Council on the Arts Grant. Bino has been working in the field of adult education, community organizing, and immigration for the past 20 years. The Asian American Writers Workshop has been dedicated to the belief that Asian American stories need to be told, highlighting the population's incredible diversity within and forging diverse alliances with artists and activists, both within and without the Asian American population. And that has really been the life's work for you both, Curtis and Bino, really has informed all your endeavors. So why don't we start with Curtis about how you came to this work and what were the contexts driving it? What motivated you? Thanks. You.
Thanks, Vivian, and thanks to the Asian American Studies program and to everybody else for joining us today. Yeah, this is a big question. How did I come into this work? If you're talking about the Asian American community specifically, I think I was exposed to it at a very young age, partly because I'm from Detroit, and it's a famous murder that I think all of you guys are familiar with, the Vincent Chin case. I was 13 at the time. He was a family friend of ours. My uncle was his best man at the wedding. And so, you know, just I think because that's such an impressionable age, right? You're really figuring out your identity. And for me, I just grew up watching Asian Americans marching, you know, and protesting and calling press conferences. And so that was very natural to me. And then moving on to college, you know, I was very active with the Asian American student groups. And that's actually where I started to get involved with more literature. You know, I didn't write much because, you know, I have a working class family background. We didn't really have books around the house, and I never really read outside of what was assigned in school. And it was when I went up to college that I started doing more creative writing, just stuff that I wanted to do. And that's when I sort of merged the two. And at college, I actually first got involved by starting a literary journal for people of color. And that's what brought me to New York, was wanting to pursue, because the Michigan program that I was in was, I think everybody else was white. I think there were 18 people in my program. It was a select program to get into. And I think I was the only person of color. And obviously that led to a lot of issues in terms of my creative voice and my creative development. And I wanted to move to New York, or to some city where I felt like I could meet other Asian American creatives and Asian American writers to sort of really refine my own voice. And that's how I came into this work. So yeah, it has been a life's journey, I guess. So.
Thank you so much, Curtis. Bino, do you want to share your kind of own reflections about this?
Yes, thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Hunter, Asian American Studies, and Curtis, thank you for joining us. And thank you to everybody who are here tonight. I recognize some names actually in the audience, and really glad to see all of you. I just want to bring attention to my background because I love Zoom backgrounds. I spend 7 hours a day on Zoom. This is the Miss Saigon protest from 1991, and that's me. So that was, you're saying 30 years, and obviously I haven't aged one day, just joking. I met Curtis in 1990. I met Curtis in 1990, and I have a very different background from Curtis because I'm an immigrant from the Philippines. When I met Curtis, I wasn't aware of Asian America and politics and any of that. I was actually looking for the gay community when I met Curtis. I met him in Gay Asian Pacific Islander Men of New York. And I went to a meeting and Curtis sat next to me. That was 1990. And he became my friend and my kind of friend, mentor, and teacher. And I wasn't looking for Asian America. I wasn't looking for Filipino America. I wasn't looking for anything. I had always written, what?
Just a boyfriend.
Just a boyfriend. I was looking for a white boyfriend, just kidding. And I ran into Curtis, and what happened then, because I think we should mention the times we lived in. And, you know, we were young, very, very young, straight out of college, and AIDS was raging all over the country. Everybody was talking about AIDS. It was at that time in 1991. I mean, if you go back to the 80s, Princess Diana, I think in 1987 was when she went to the ward and shook hands for the first time of people with HIV. And Rock Hudson passed in 1985. So AIDS was already in the vocabulary of a lot of people. They knew what was happening. And it was severely impacting my life because I was coming out as a young gay man and didn't really have the tools to navigate that world. And I did not know that it was more complicated than I thought. It was not just the AIDS crisis that I encountered then. There was also the whole issue of Asian American identity. And that's how it began. So in 1991, I found out that Curtis was writing poetry. And I had been writing since I was 12. And it was probably just luck, pure luck, that I ran into someone who was also passionate about writing.
So that's great. Can maybe, Bino, you can speak a little bit to the times, and Curtis as well. Like, what was the Miss Saigon controversy? I mean, I remember, but you know, I'm also on the older side. So what was the Miss Saigon controversy for folks? Why is it important? And you know, what was going on with anti-Asian hate at that time? You just kind of set up the lay of the land for us.
Okay, so in 1989, Miss Saigon debuted in London, in the West End. And it was everything you want to know. It's Orientalism from A through Z. You had yellow face, you had white actors playing Asian characters, and you have bare naked women gyrating, and you have Asia, and you have war, in Vietnam. And they brought that to New York, to Broadway in 1991. So before it even came to Broadway, it was already very, very controversial. And when it came here, I remember Jonathan Pryce had prosthetic eyes so he could look more Asian, and bronze his skin so he could look more Vietnamese. And there were so many, many issues around it. There were a lot of protests. I believe the Actors' Equity protested against the coming of Miss Saigon to Broadway. It was really, really layered. And another part of that was they're bringing in, and this touched me a lot, because they're bringing in an actress from the Philippines to Broadway in America, where Asian American women didn't even get a chance to apply for that job. Or, Lea Salonga, Filipinos flocked the debut of Asian America, which I questioned because they didn't see it as Asian American activism. They saw it as pride. It was very, very conflicting for me. And we protested against it. It was led by the gay Asian American community and a lot of lesbian and the LGBT community in 1991.
There was a lot of LGBT representation in those protests, particularly when a prominent gay and lesbian organization was holding a fundraiser. And I think that angle of it. But one of the reasons that I moved to New York was that I actually had a internship, which turned into a job at a place called Pan Asian Repertory Theater, which I think everybody, they were very, very instrumental in it, in that struggle. And I think for them, or for us, I should say, the issue was not just all the things that Bino brought up about representation, yellow face, et cetera, was that the producers said this really derogatory statement, how they had done a worldwide casting search, but could not find a single qualified Asian man to play the role of the engineer. And I think that was the part that really struck a nerve with a lot of the theater community, at least. And so I had that vantage point of both being queer and being part of the Asian American, queer Asian protest part of it, but also part of the mainstream Asian American group through my work at Pan Asian Rep. So yeah, it was a very interesting time.
What you are both bringing into the conversation is, the idea of invisibility, right? And then also saying that there's nobody qualified. I think that's what you were bringing into that conversation, qualified to act in that play, or qualified, perhaps, I know this just from having spoken with you both and knowing about the Asian American Writers Workshop, that there's no one qualified to write beautiful literature. Is that, could you speak a little bit more about that?
The issue of authenticity. Okay, shameless plug. This is in my memoir that I'm writing. Part of the reason I left the University of Michigan was I had gotten into this really great creative writing program. I think there was maybe 18 or 20 people in it, 15 fiction writers and 3 poets. I was one of the poets. And through that, I was able to take advanced creative writing classes with MFA students. And I took an advanced level fiction writing class. And the instructor at that time said to the class that, oh, you guys are all young writers, you should be able to write whatever you want. And all the other writers who were white, or many of them, decided to write as people of color. But then they would say really offensive things that, I don't think writers of color would say, like, oh, I love my brown skin, or I looked at my almond-shaped eye, just really offensive things. And I would always have to say something because that's who I am. I just say things when they bother me. And when it came time for me to turn in my story, I didn't want to write in another voice. I wanted to write as an Asian American because I felt like I never really got to hear those stories. And because I was working full time, I felt like I had a very precious amount of time to actually do writing. So I'm just going to write a story from my own childhood. And so I wrote about growing up in Detroit's Chinatown and going to Sunday school, Chinese language school, and having a crush on my instructor. And I turned in the story, and the other classmates all really liked it. They said positive things. My instructor didn't say anything, but instead asked me to show up to her office hours at the end the next day, and which I did. I showed up. And the first thing she said to me was that, I need to stop talking about race because it just really slowed down the energy in the class, and it I don't know, constricted or whatever the other white writers. But then she said, this story is too good to be from an undergraduate. I want to know where you stole the story from. And I'm like, well, on one hand, she liked the story, which is great. But on the other hand, you basically accused me of theft. I mean, and I think that just epitomized for me the struggles that writers of color have within predominantly white institutions, where white writers are oftentimes praised for the things that they say, even co-opting things, and really, their imagination is praised, versus, writers of color, even when we tell authentic stories, they're questioned, they're somehow suspect, they're, not to be trusted. And so I think that was my understanding of, and why I never considered going to an MFA program. I was like, why would I go to an MFA program and pay lots of money just to encounter more white racism? And that's why I felt like, well, why don't I just move to New York and find other Asian American writers and work together and create our own place where we can provide honest feedback, critical feedback that helps us grow as writers, right? Not because we just want a safety comfort zone by working together with other Asian American writers, but because we can push each other and we can ask those tough questions, and because we have that insight into the other stories that these people are working on. So it's, in some ways, the Writers' Workshop wasn't just a safety net, but it was really more of a launching pad, right? Because it pushed us to be better writers, I think. And so that's my thought on, the idea of authenticity and ability to do that. So.
Thank you for sharing such a powerful story. I'm sorry that happened to you, but I'll share what, anyway, a mentor once shared with me. This person, the faculty member, meaning did you a favor, right? Because you responded with basically founding or co-founding the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it did the world a favor, right? So that's one way to look at it, although I'm sure it was not a happy experience at the time. Bino, do you want to kind of enter that conversation?
Yeah. I actually want to go back to the 90s. The term Asian America is widely used now. If you mention it to anyone, no one will question you. But in 1991, in the 90s, when you say Asian America, they're not thinking of the diversity within that big unit. It's even in the Asian American Writers Workshop, part of our discussion was always, in literature, you have the dominant Japanese American and Chinese American. And there are a lot of missing people within that spectrum in Asian America. And those stories are not being published. I mean, in just the past 10 years alone, I think you would really see this huge proliferation of Filipino American literature. That didn't exist 30 years ago. That didn't. When we talk about Asian American literature, we're talking about Amy Tan, and there's Maxine Hong Kingston. If you could even read her book, if you could access it. But basically, Amy Tan. It was the same year that I think Dog Eaters came out. So there's like a little bit of like Asian American, a Filipino American presence there, but Dog Eaters was set in the Philippines. So it's a lot of question whether that even qualified for Asian America. So there's a lot of discussion what Asian America is in literature and what it meant to us. And we called it a generic Asian American Writers Workshop for the lack of other, I don't know, I think Curtis coined the term, and we just went with it, but we never called it Asian American Writers Workshop. We just say we're going to the workshop. It's always the workshop, and we knew exactly what we were talking about. And I think within a year, we started producing anthologies that included other groups within Asian America. We started a journal that actually included a word called Pacific. We called it Asian Pacific American Journal. We changed it and we called it APA, and started to expand, and we had Indian Americans there, and Filipino Americans and Filipino immigrants and so on. And it was very, very diverse. It's still quite queer, in fact. So we're already addressing the issue of diversity within organizations. And I think that was also touching the whole scope of literature. That I think this whole thing basically is spring-rolled in the next 3 decades, creating a really diverse forum for writers to discuss within those communities.
So thanks so much. How did that diversity, happen? I think this is a really important question too, that we're all raising, because I think today, in addition to the theme around invisibility that's come up around Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, there's also the issue of that diversity within the Asian American Pacific Islander population, but that there's not a lot of solidarity or working together or even knowing of one another's stories and histories. So that's, so I think this is really significant in that sense. And I know, and was struck by, as you were saying, the special issues of the journals that you all had on Korean Americans, on Vietnamese Americans, a special issue on gays and queer identity, right? The book, Contours of the Heart, focusing on South Asians, and Flippin', focusing on Filipinos. And before I turn it back to Curtis, I do want to say, make a little shout out to the Asian American Studies program here at Hunter College. That we have a terrific course, Filipino American literature, that Luis Francia taught for many, many years, and that is now taught by Fidelito Cortez. And we're just so lucky, fortunate. And we also have another many great courses on Asian American writers, South Asian American women writers that Farah Kidwai teaches. So I could go on, but I won't. so Curtis, do you want to take it?
You mean the conscious effort to make sure that we were inclusive?
Yeah, exactly. And how did that happen? How did it feel?
Well, I think that we were very conscious. I mean, even I like to remark that even at our first meeting, like a third of the people were biracial, half Black, half Korean at our meeting. We were very inclusive, I think. I don't know how it happened, Bino, or maybe it's just because, we're both like that, open-minded and just trying to push the definition of what Asian American is. I think I mentioned to you earlier, Vivian, that I did feel like as a Chinese American, the space that we occupy within Asian America as being, at that point, one of the dominant segments, that it was important for me to make sure that the voices from some of the different communities that we don't hear from as often, did get that space. And I think that was deliberate in terms of looking at our publications, right? Yes, we did the first APA journal, which was a collective of diverse voices from different ethnicities, but then we quickly did a Korean American anthology, and then we did the gay and lesbian anthology. And then, like you said, we did anthologies for the different communities, South Asian, which won the American Book Award, by the way, Flippin', and then the Vietnamese American, and hopefully these were important books. I mean, that came out in the early 90s. So I think people who are studying Asian American literature, it gave them a great marking point in that, in the sense of how Asian American literature has developed over the last several decades. But I think sometimes you do have to be conscious of these things. I don't think these things just happen. Diversity, you always have to be sensitive to that. You always have to look at, gender issues, homophobia, like, making sure that that you're always reminding people that this is a safe, inclusive space, no matter where you're coming from. And that, I think, was one of the hallmarks of the workshop at the beginning, was that we really tried to make it an open door for anybody. And that included not just diversity in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever, but also in terms of ambitions of a writer, right? We accepted anybody, from the people that wanted to just write in their journal just for themselves and not wanting to share with anybody else except, the writing group, to people that wanted to be published with one of the big publishers and reach a mass audience. And we felt there was value in every type of writing. And so we really, really had an inclusive vision, artistically too, about the organization too. So.
Yeah. I'll just add quickly that, when I met Curtis in a gay Asian space. And in the 90s, when AIDS was raging in New York City, it was a very, very difficult time. I mean, looking back now, we actually knew a lot of people who were dying around us. And meanwhile, we were being subjected to racism within, in the gay Asian community as well. And, the whole emasculation of gay men, we were already very aware of it then because we were living it. Do other people find us attractive as gay men? It's et cetera, et cetera. So I think a lot of that, a lot of those issues actually moved into the literary space as well. Because I think we benefited a lot from the fact that I think in the 90s, a very diverse group of Asian Americans actually came of age. They were just around us. I mean, I remember Vina Cabrera-Sud was half Filipino, half Indian. Who knew they existed? But there she was, and she's the same age. Lisa Simmons, who's half Black and half Korean American. There she was, not sure when they were born, probably the late 60s, early 70s. But we were surrounded by people like them who were also questioning what's happening around us, why they're not included, why their voices were not being heard, and so on and so forth. And the climate was so ripe for all of this. Because one thing what we haven't mentioned is when we first met, we were provided space by the Committee of Anti-Asian Violence. They gave us a table. And CAV then was a really fierce organization that protested in the streets against anti-Asian violence all the time and police brutality. In 1992, they had the 10-year anniversary of Vincent Chen. They really spearheaded the whole thing. So there's a lot of awareness on Asian America and diversity even then, and of anti-Asian hate that was happening around us. Not the same way that it's being publicized now, but it was happening then already.
Are the times just so different? Or how can we respond to the times today in a way that is fruitful, in a way that speaks to, basically you're talking about organizing work, solidarity work within the arts, right? Feeling one another's stories, understanding that we're all in it together. How can we, move forward with that today, starting with the arts, but in other domains as well?
I mean, I feel like it's already happening. I'm an eternal optimist. I don't know if you picked that up, but one of the things that I talk about as I tour my film Vincent Who, which is actually a film that came out in 2009 and looked at the Vincent Chin case and the impact that it has had on the development of an Asian American political movement. When I'm on the road, because I'm still getting invited to screen that film, I've gone to like 500-600 places with that film alone. One of the things that I've been most recently talking about is the difference between the Asian American community in 1982, when I was just a kid, and seeing that, versus 2009, when the film first came out, and now 2021, 12 years after that. And the thing that I talk about is the fact that racism existed, right? Back then. It existed when my family first came to this country in the late 1800s. It is always going to be around. Right? As Asian Americans, we are always going to have to face some amount of racism. The big difference, though, that has changed in these past 30 odd years is our community's ability to respond and even just the basic concept of this term Asian American, as Bino referred to a little bit earlier, which was in flux back then when we first met and the workshop was first coming about, is that you see our community's ability to respond back and to feel united has just increased so much. I mean, when you think about all the hate crimes that happened this early spring directed at Asian Americans and how our community quickly rallied around each other and raised public awareness about these things, part of it is that we've got these new tools that we've been really good at using, but part of it is just that we have a population now that is frankly more comfortable even using the term Asian American, right? And maybe that's part of it, of having more second, third, fourth generation Asian Americans. But I also think that even immigrants now are understanding that there is a connection between the different Asian ethnicities and that there is a value in terms of working together and understanding how we're being perceived in this country. And so I feel like that's why I'm excited, as always, for our community, is that, look at the progress that we've made, in combating the hate crimes against us and the hate incidents against us. We've come a long way. And I just think that we're going to continue to, move in the right direction. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I also want to just give a shout out to Chris Kwok, who teaches Asian American Studies at Hunter. He teaches Asian Americans in Public Policy. And of course, he was the co-author of that very influential report that the Asian American Bar Association of New York released, right? The Rising Tide of Hate and How to Combat It. And really, they pushed in terms of getting the the hate crimes bill through. So just want to give a shout out to that as well. And so, Bino, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
I think social media is playing a really, really big role in publicizing everything that's going on around us. And it has good and bad sides. In the 90s, we had the newspapers and we had TV, and then we had the streets. It was more organic, and people who become activists were really walking the talk. And we were really out there, and we were really living it. So we felt it, and it informed the way we thought as young people. And I think eventually affected the way we write and the way we look at the world around us. It's different then. 30 years later, we have Twitter, everything is a hashtag, and you don't know what they are. And it's I question a lot of these things that's happening around us. I still go to protests and marches, and I think you see the numbers when you see when you find the hashtag on Twitter. If you look for Stop Asian Hate, which is a hashtag, you can find posts from just anyone. And I don't know what they mean necessarily. And I don't know whether they're activism. I don't know if all of these voices, the number of voices that we're hearing in social media, actually create change. I don't know. And it's very, very similar to to 1991. I mean, what's interesting is this year obviously is the 30th anniversary of the workshop, and none of the founders actually had pictures from 1991. They kept asking us, do you have pictures? Because they're kind of thinking we had cell phones then. No, we didn't. What cell phone? We didn't take pictures. Why would we do that? We post for the New York Times, and that's how I ended up, with this Zoom background. We didn't document it then the way we're documenting it now, but there's just too much out there. And sometimes I'm finding that activism is turning into this massive performance. That's really, really hard to say whether it's making an impact for change or not.
I will say something in comparison to that, though, Bino, is that, yes, I think back on those 90s, and literally we were going to a protest every weekend. So we were protesting something. And there is some type of emotional, personal gratification you get being out on the streets and yelling and holding the signs and stuff like that. But you know, and that is different than the type of, like you said, this Twitter active, or Joel says Slacktivism. I mean, it's different in that sense. Is yeah, you might feel disconnected a little bit, and you might not know the motives of all the other people that you're siding with. But I think when you look at legislation and other things that have passed and representation and policy, you can definitely see there's some results there. So it is a different sense of gratification for the activists, I believe, right? Maybe you're looking for different things, but I don't think you can argue with the results. Maybe you could argue with maybe the pace of the results, but I think you have to at least acknowledge there has been some progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, thank you, Kevin, for the question. We are going to do a Q&A, but we're going to do it. I just have one final thing, probably around starting at 6 o'clock, if that's all right. And so, but I am monitoring the chat. So two things. I mean, one, definitely, I think, Bino, you're kind of singing my song, but we're also in the same generation. So in the sense of, what does activism mean today, right? In a world of social media, is it liking a post? Is it sharing a post? Or is it actually, going out there, right? Creating something, doing something and being out there. So I wanted to know if you could just share a little bit about how you all, forged alliances, right? The Asian American Writers Workshop with other American writers of color, with other American writers, with activists from other social movements. I mean, I think that's also a big, big question today that confronts us in terms of making change, social change, meaningful social change, is how do we create alliances? How do we partner?
Do you want to start, Bino? Or
Yeah, I can. I'd like to mention, I want to go back to the Gay Asian Pacific Islander community at 1991. I think at least 3 organizations, gay lesbian organizations, were founded around the same time. And they actually started a Filipino American lesbian gay organization, which lasted about 5 years maybe. And I think we were not, I'm not sure if we were consciously forging alliances with other organizations. I do know that we are really, really trying hard to be visible. And really trying hard to make sure that our voices were heard out there. Because I remember Outweek, Outweek was the gay and lesbian magazine at that time, very, very visible, and how our peers demanded that they put us on the cover of Outweek. And because of Miss Saigon, which was led by a lot of lesbian, gay, Asian Americans, and being included in Outweek on the cover, we actually, when we marched in the Gay Pride March, it was the biggest march of Asian Americans they had ever seen. And it was very, very organic. I don't think, and Curtis can comment on this, whether we were actually consciously saying, okay, I'm reaching out to you and I want to make alliances with you. I think it was, our group did not exist, and now we do, and you just have to deal with it. that kind of thing. It's like in your face, we are here, we are queer, get used to it. I think they're still chanting that, aren't they?
As I said before, I think that all this, has to be a certain amount of intentionality, for these things to happen. I do agree with you, though, is that in terms of how you dissect what the intention is, that might not have been as clear. But I think for the gay aspect of it is because you and I met in a gay space, and because we were both members of ACT UP and Queer Nation at that time, and we were very marginalized within the gay white movement at that time, that we connected with gay Latinos and gay African Americans and gay Native Americans a lot. And, you know, similar to the fact that we had a lot of artists in our group of AIDS activists, there were also a lot of artists in the Latino, you know, activist community, AIDS activist community, and the Black activist communities. And so we bonded first as activists of color fighting AIDS, but because our day jobs were in the arts, it just, you know, was like a natural connection. It's like, oh, I know this person's in this group, I know this person's in this group. You know what I mean? Where it started to become really intentional was that as we started to grow from just a ragtag group of writers meeting in an office space to an organization with a certain amount of profile, it did become more intentional in terms of wanting to make those outreaches and deliberately doing things at the New Ricans Poets Cafe and reaching out to African-American writers, you know, and getting the support from other writers of color too. I mean, Walter Mosley supported us very early on, you know, inviting us to more mainstream things, trying to connect us to a broader, you know, literary community. But I think you do have to be, I don't think it just happens, you know. I think there has to be a thought behind it of like, you know, why you're doing it. So.
Mm-hmm.
So can I ask you, I mean, so what did it, you know, we've been living with the pandemic it's going on the second year. We've been living with the, you know, economic fallout and the pandemics of hate against so many groups in the United States. I mean, how does it feel to you both in terms of experiencing that and thinking through? I know you're an optimist, Curtis. Yeah, but thinking through, so what's next, right? I mean, where can we go with this?
You know, truthfully, the big change is back in the day, we were fighting Fauci, right?
Yeah.
And now he's on our side. That's the biggest change.
So say more about that, because I think I know what you're talking about, but I think there are folks in the audience who might not.
Dr. Fauci at the time was, you know, leading the efforts in terms of AIDS and finding a vaccine or a cure or something, whatever. And so the gay community at that time, the gay and lesbian community, was very vocal in terms of pushing him and you know, getting structural changes, challenging procedures and things like that, things we take for granted in the medical community, because we were frankly dying, as Bino was saying. You know, we had friends who were getting ill and dying, and there was no time to wait for, you know, test trials and things like that. We were that desperate, and it's just interesting how it's changed in some ways. You know, between while we are once again live as a gay community, or as members of the gay community, we are once again having to deal with a plague impact our lives. It is quite, in some ways, it is quite different in terms of how AIDS was perceived and how COVID is perceived.
Yeah.
And how we are to, you know.
Yeah, Bino, say more, please.
You know, AIDS was very, very personal. And because we were young and inexperienced, and we had no one to talk to, the whole world was attacking us. So we were already marginalized as young gay men. And because there was the AIDS pandemic that nobody really understood. So we were looked at differently. While it was a global, you know, problem, it was also specific to a community. You know, it was growing, but still concentrated in the gay community at that time. So it was just about us, right? And COVID is you know, when COVID happened, it happened really, really quickly. It spread and it's global, and it did not discriminate, as they always say. Now, you know, they use that term a lot. Anybody could get it. They didn't look at AIDS that way. You know, I think around that time it was the term meant for M, actually meant for men, came to light because there were I think Black men sleeping with, who are married to women who are sleeping with Black men who didn't call themselves gay and would never check the gay box. In that way, they didn't really know who has it, who's spreading it, and how it was spreading to other communities. So all of these issues was coming out into the open, at that time. But they were very, very personal issues. I always tell people I'm part of the latex generation. We were not allowed to have sex without a condom. I mean, that was, that is next level. To just have to process that you have to live like that and not have anyone to talk to because no one could understand was very, very hard. COVID, we all understand it, whether you believe in it or not. But I could tell you that when the pandemic was declared last year, I had the tools to deal with it because of AIDS, because I survived AIDS, and Curtis and I did, thank universe. And we, through the 30 years, we gained something from it that, you could use when something like this happens again, whatever that is.
And what were those tools? Could you say more? Like, what were the specific tools that you learned that you then adapted to today's context?
Basically, really knowing how to put paranoia to work. I just knew. I turned my apartment into this decontamination space. I just knew exactly point by point how to be careful, because during the AIDS crisis, we had to learn, and no one taught us how to do this.
Bino put a giant condom over his apartment. Bino put a giant condom over his whole apartment.
Yes, we put wear it over our heads. But all of those things, you can't just have sex with anyone. You have to make sure you always have a condom with you if you ever do it, and maybe not have sex with people. It's and you put that to practice with any infectious diseases, because you don't want to get contaminated.
I think what it taught me is this idea that you do have to stand up for yourself and you do have to protect yourself, because negotiating safe sex is a very uncomfortable situation, and oftentimes if you don't have self-esteem, right, you might do things that compromise yourself or put yourself in a vulnerable situation. And I think going through that in AIDS really taught me, once again, to really stand up for yourself. Even if I know that's an intimate situation, it's different, but the issues are the same, right? You're negotiating with someone and you need to stand up. And where that made me more comfortable and more prepared is like, so for instance, I just completed a 12-school tour of one of my films, the Vincent Chin film, just last week or so. I went to 12 different schools, a lot of them in central Pennsylvania, which people call Pennsyltucky, but I felt comfortable enough because I could ask them the questions and make demands and say, look, do you have this? You know what I mean? What is the ventilation here? How many students are, you know what I mean? And I think going through the AIDS crisis, or whatever you want to call it, taught me that, if I'm at all concerned about a situation, I need to ask, and I should not feel bad about asking questions or making demands when my safety or my health comes into play. And I think that that's something that I learned through AIDS. And I think that's, lends into activism, right? Knowing how to stand up for yourself and not be afraid of looking like an idiot or, feeling like you're somehow weird or whatever. Stand up for yourself, protect yourself, look out for yourself. So.
No, that's really insightful. And I also wanted to give a shout out. I'm sorry, it's my job. Right? I have to give shout outs. And so, I want to as well, but of course. But I also wanted to give a shout out to Glenn McPantai, who is, I think, in our Zoom room today. And of course, he's a civil rights leader and longtime activist. and he teaches 3 great courses for us at Hunter, but 2 of them are particularly apt for this conversation: Asian American Civil Rights and Law and Asian American Queerness. All right, so at this point, I'm going to segue into the Q&A. And so if you have a question for our fabulous speakers, please put it in the chat. And I think that there was a question that Kevin Lee raised. And so I'll start off with that one. But folks, please put your questions in the chat. Is there such a thing as a quiet activism for the AAPI community in 2021? Are we seeing a movement that is also reflective of our communities?
I saw that on chat. I was actually wondering what quiet activism means. Does that mean armchair activism? What is quiet activism?
So Kevin, are you still with us? Do you want to elaborate on the question a bit more?
Yeah, I'm here. I think what I was thinking about was just yeah, I think sometimes you hear a lot of the stereotypes regarding the Asian community that, oh, we're quiet, we work hard. I don't know, some of those characteristics. And when I think of, I think of, and think about what you guys have done, and yeah, like, and also, just the activism, like just from the civil rights era to the 90s, and just fast forward to 2021, I think there is some value to social media, and I guess maybe I speak as a younger person. It gives people who sometimes where they don't have an outlet, or they don't have they're not able to protest on the streets, a voice. I don't know, I'm not sure how strong or weak or how it compares to other times, but so that's why I asked that question, like, is there a movement where it's more inclusive, where it includes more people within the Asian community?
Thank you, Kevin. I think it's a great question. Curtis or Bino, which one would like to go first?
Well, I mean, I agreed with Kevin. I didn't have a opposing view like Bino did, right, in terms of the value of the new tools that we have. And I think that with each generation, you have to ask how they communicate, where they're at. We can't expect young people who, to have the same life experiences and meet where we meet. I mean, if you just wanted to just say on a purely social level, like as gay men, how did we meet each other back in the days, back in the 90s? We met at bars, right? Gay men don't go to bars anymore. At least that's what I hear. I don't know. I've been married for such a long time. I hear they don't go to bars anymore. And I hear that they're on, these apps, right? So if you want to reach the community and spread the message, you have to go where they're at. And that's why I feel like, I mean, whether I call that quiet activism, I think that's where I sort of stumbled upon it. I mean, it does change, but activism changes, by the tools that we have. And so it is different. It looks different. I'm glad of the generation that I'm part of, I feel like maybe we were a transitional generation from the 60s, to what we have now. But I feel grateful to have been able to participate in so many big protests in New York, but also marches in Washington. Those are some of my fondest memories in terms of shaping my identity. But I don't know if a young person these days and age would be able to connect or feel that same way, or like seeing something like the AIDS quilt, having that come out at that generation. I don't know if something like the AIDS quilt would come out now, right? But hopefully maybe the equivalent for young people is making a TikTok video, right? And And so we have to appreciate that too. So I'm all for supporting. And the second part of your question, are we seeing a movement that's more reflective of our community? Yeah, definitely. Because, stereotypically, it's really interesting because one of the things about the gay movement is it relies on this word called pride, right? Which is like standing up, speaking out for yourself, which in some ways is antithetical maybe to traditional Asian thought, where it's like the nail that sticks up gets pounded in. I mean, it teaches you the exact opposite. But I feel like, what we try to do is we navigate this space that honors those traditions and maybe other traditions of more of a community orientation or consensus building, and some of those values, and somehow infuse a sense of pride and being able to stand up within that context. So we are changing the definition of how you exhibit your pride, and so I do think that it is happening.
And yeah, I definitely think that also it's a way, a different way. It's expanding how we think about leadership, right? And taking action. Yeah, I also have a response, but I want to make sure Bino kind of jumps into the conversation first.
I remember attending the Women's March a few years ago. And I remember feeling very disappointed because I didn't see a lot of Asian Americans there. And in fact, whenever I look at protest pictures, I look for Asian Americans and always feel disappointed when I don't see a lot. I mean, you see the young people there, but you don't see a lot, and it saddens me because I think it's really, really important to be present in those spaces. Black Lives Matter, we have to be out there. And when something happens that concerns police brutality against another group, we have to be out there because we are going to be targets as well. And we are seeing that more and more now. And, social media has memory. Everybody looks at it and people remember who is absent in these protests. And everybody's present in social media because everybody's hashtagging, whether it's a joke, whether it's real. You just cannot tell the difference because there's too much white noise. So I think we're still negotiating the space of what the validity and legitimacy of online activism, and whether quiet activism is a good thing. I do believe, from having been an act of activism, that silence equals death, that we have to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for the other groups as well. Because what is different now from the 90s is that our enemies are within. They're not the other people from another group. I mean, within the Filipino American community, we're so fragmented. It's Filipino American History Month, they call it. But the country has a dictator in it, and majority of, more than half the people support that president. And there's such a huge discussion within the Filipino American community about this because we're so divided. We just can't seem to agree on what is the right thing to do. And I think that is happening in a bigger scope now because we just do not agree on so many different things. I mean, we are diversifying in terms of ideas as well. So it's getting harder and harder to coalesce.
So I wanted to bring, thank you, Bino. I wanted to bring into the conversation a comment from Lynn, who's in the audience, and I'm going to read it. I think there is quiet activism. I also appreciate that activism can take many forms. Heart of Dinner, right? The small group of volunteers who feed Asian elders weekly by delivering them food. They saw a need during COVID and they tried to support the Asian elderly community. So I wanted to make sure that we bring that into the larger conversation. And I also wanted to say to Kevin and to everyone around this question is, I do think there is a place for quiet activism. Definitely, in addition to what Bino has raised, I mean, of taking voice, right? But some people need to kind of work their ways up to taking voice in a rally or a protest, right? And ways that they can do that are volunteering, right? You know, through community-based nonprofits, being there for people in that way, helping out with public programming. For example, the public library, if they want some sort of public programming about Asian Americans, solidarity and activism, I think that would be a great way. Some people who are, you know, not our students, but they might be our alums, right? And so they're older, they're in the workplace now full time, although that also could describe some of our students at Hunter. And so there are ways in which you can think about transferring the skills that you develop in your volunteer activities and in the activism out of the workplace and bring them back into the workplace to think about developing affinity groups or what are the conversations that should be happening within your workplace. So that's what I would say. And then we have a terrific question from Bino Realuyo.
Can I follow up on that though?
Oh yes, of course.
I'm thinking back on Kevin's question, are we seeing a movement that is also reflective of our community? And it just makes me think, and combining this with Lynn's example, is that, you know, one thing they say about Asians is that we don't say, I love you, right? But we show it by the things that we do, right? And maybe that's something that Asians, maybe that's an Asian cultural thing, where we're not direct in vocalizing things, but we show our priorities, our values, or whatever through action only, right? And so maybe that is an example of that activism, you know, which is more reflective of Asian American community, which is more community building, right? Something about the Asian American community historically has been that a lot of the nonprofits and a lot of the community-based groups have been doing a lot more direct service things, programs, you know, elderly programs, et cetera. Where we've shifted is that we've started to now do policy advocacy, right? You'll see the budgets of these nonprofits now allocating more funds towards it. So I think you sort of see that that has been happening. You know, the activism that we've been doing has been much more reflective of our community and the values and how we express ourselves and how we motivate ourselves, you know. And so I think that's always been there. It's always been part of our community. And again, Lynn's example is a perfect one. Whether or not that translates into the more, you know, vocal, you know, in the street shouting type of activism, you know, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I also don't know if that's necessary to happen, you know, so anyway.
No, thank you so much. I do want to share, because you provided an opportunity for me to share a personal anecdote, which I think is probably familiar to some of the Asian American Pacific Islanders in the audience, which is, of course, what you were saying, Curtis, is that it's not typical. Well, it's not typical in Asian immigrant families, but particularly working class families like the one in which I grew up in, to really talk, number one, right? And you just really, it's how are you? It's really, have you eaten, right? That's really how my mom to this day still expresses love, right? To myself and my brothers, right? It's have you eaten? And I think that's important, that that's, you have to start where you're starting from, I guess, and move from there. But I wanted to get to Bino Realuyo's great question. He says, thank you, it's in the chat. He wants to also give a shout out to his students in Filipino American literature here at Hunter, around 10 of whom are here. And he says, one of the things the Asian American Writers Workshop has been doing very well, in addition to their literary and arts outreach and activism around Asian American issues, is providing a forum for international activists like Maria Reza from the Philippines, who is co-winner of this year's Nobel Prize in 2019, to talk about the suppression of press freedom and other human rights issues in the Philippines. Do either of you see more Asian American Writers Workshop engagement in global issues such as climate change in the future?
Maria Ressa was brought to the workshop by a Filipino American media group, I think, and hosted her here. I think it's very important also to point out that Maria Ressa is actually Filipino American. She grew up in New Jersey, went to high school there, worked for CNN, and went back to the Philippines to found Rappler, and recently won, we all know now, the Nobel Peace Prize. And Curtis and I are actually not directly involved with the workshop anymore, at least not in the organizing capacity. But maybe Curtis can talk to a vision that how we can make the movement more global. But it's very important to because Asian American literature, it's not just America. My first novel was based in the Philippines, and it was not embraced by Asian American academics because it was based in the Philippines. And it's very, very hard to explain to Asian America in general that we Filipinos are not the same in a way, because many of us come to this country, or most of us, speaking English already. When we founded the workshop, I had been in this country for only 6 years. I published a novel 14 years after arrival. I mean, who can do that? And I was able to do that because I spoke English. And we were a former American colony, the only one. And we had a different relationship to America than someone, from Hong Kong who grew up in the United States. It's very different. Or someone like Maria Ressa, that we all look at as a Filipino woman, actually went to school in New Jersey. So what does that mean? Is she part of Asian America? I think she is. So is it global? I think it has always been.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting part, because Bino and I come from really different backgrounds. Do you know what I mean? He has an immigrant story. I don't. I mean, I don't have any relatives in China for like multiple generations, right? I mean, so I never really was interested in Asian identity or Asian politics or any of that. I'm very rooted in American stuff. And so that's maybe my blind spot or my bias or whatever. But I also think that America has changed from 30 years ago. And I think that the workshop these days is reflective of that globalization, right? And Bino's right. I don't have an active role in it, but I'm on the list. I know what they're doing, and it seems like they're more international these days. But I think that that's partly, again, globalization and I don't want to say exporting of American ideas, but definitely exporting American ideas of how to combat some of these things. Like, for instance, so I've been able to travel to, I think, like 15 or 16 countries around the world, talking about social justice and racial equality. And so I'm able to connect with other groups. Like, for instance, 2 weeks ago, I did a talk for the University of Oslo in Norway, and I connected with Norwegian Asians. I mean, so in that sense, we're building these bonds, right? Just because it's so easy now with the internet. But I also, and I think that's a good thing on one hand, but I also think that we have to be careful that we're making sure that what's happening isn't just this notion of a global elite of people who have a certain education level, a certain class level, who are able to actually communicate, organize, and whatever. And how do you break that so that it's, much more class diverse, these things?
And thank you, Fidelito, for that question. It's very interesting, the conversation being global. Recently, there's this whole conversation about gender because of the use of Filipinx, which is a copy from Latinx. A lot of Filipino Americans are adding X's to, for identity, gender identity purposes. And questioned a lot by Filipinos in the Philippines because our language does not have gender pronouns. So why are Filipino Americans colonizing the Filipino language? I mean, why are we, even telling them to do the same thing that's happening here when we don't use gender pronouns. In fact, I'm one of those people, I don't say gender pronouns in groups. It's very, very sexy to do that now. You know, I identify as he, him. I say my language does not have gender pronouns, dot. Because I want them to understand that we're not the same. You know, it's you know, Filipinos are putting Filipino Americans in check when they try to export something like that. It's very, very American sensibility without even thinking that maybe it doesn't apply to other people in other countries. And it's a very interesting conversation because Filipinos in the Philippines can put them in check using the same language that's being imposed on them.
Well, the irony that someone told me is that with the Spanish language, X is not used. So actually saying Latin X is actually adopting English language colonization. You know.
And Margaret said it's now Latin. I noticed that. I saw that a month ago. Margaret Chen wrote, it's now Latin with an E.
I know. And even just this whole term BIPOC, and it's like every time there's a new term, and my head spins a little bit, you know.
Yeah, the Gay Center used to be called the Gay Center in 1990. And then it became the Lesbian and Gay Center. And when we were organizing, we were always saying gay for everyone, even women. So it's very hard to pay attention. And queer then was being born, you know, and now it's widely used. I just want to shout out to Marie Myung Oakley is actually in the house.
Yes, I saw. I had to mute her though.
I tried. We just got muted.
So who's in the house?
Marie is in the house.
Oh, Marie. Hey, Marie.
Do you want to say something, Marie? I'm sorry, I muted you.
No, I'm just enjoying listening to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay. It's good to have you in the house. Okay. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Margaret Chen, who's in the audience. She's, of course, longtime advocate, supporter of Asian American studies, and particularly at Hunter College and elsewhere in our nation, and longtime activist, and longtime supporter of solidarity work, and also author of the award-winning book Stuck, which is about the bamboo ceiling that Asian Americans confront in the corporate workplace. And I think that a lot of what was shared tonight resonates in that. It's a different context, a different domain, but it is the idea of invisibility, of not being seen as a leader, and all of that playing out in a different arena. But I also wanted to ask Curtis and Bino if you have some final reflections that you wanted to share with us, and then I'm going to make some announcements.
Reflections?
Yeah, some final takeaways. We're rounding, into the close of tonight's wonderful program. So if you have some takeaways for us about Asian Americans, arts, the activism, solidarity work, leadership, I don't know, just throwing out some of the themes that we tackled tonight, that you all tackled actually.
I love being Asian American. I love my community. I'm optimistic. Yes, we have challenges coming up, but I don't really know if I have any. Bino, do you have any additional reflections that you want to?
Yeah, I can't tell art and activism apart. I can't separate them. For me, it's one unit because it's my life. It's how I've lived and how I've become. I was a foreign service graduate who went to school in Washington, D.C. and suddenly became an activist and published a novel, thanks to the Asian American Writers Workshop. And it's the life that I have enjoyed and I've been really, really passionate about. But I think these days, political activism is a very sexy word. And a lot of people are conflating it and thinking especially in the poetry world, just about anyone is an activist now because it's how you get published. You write certain words in a poem and suddenly it's political. It's political activism could take many, many forms, obviously, and literature could be one of them. But I think we should not lose touch with community organizing because it's still much, much needed out there, to be seen by other groups, that we are supporting them, that we are there for them, that we are with, Black Lives Matter, that we have to have presence in all of these spaces, not just in our own when we're being victimized. This way, one way of building bridges with them is to be with these groups when they are hurting. And it should be done in many, many different ways, not just writing about them. We should be there for them.
I have something to add.
Sure.
So we live in a very divided country now, right? And I don't think politicians can bring us together. I don't think business leaders can bring us together. I'd even doubt, and no offense to educators, but I don't even know if educators can bring us together because you guys have been so politicized, right? The way we look at fact versus figure. But I think that artists can do this, right? I think we can turn to the artists to help heal our country and bring us together by reimagining spaces and a new vocabulary and places where we can have conversations again with one another instead of just being in these separate silos that we occupy, because these silos are in everything, right? Like the news that we watch, the schools that we go to, the classes that we sign up for, but maybe through art, which, can bridge these things and bring different groups together. Maybe that's the key, and that's the role of the artists moving forward.
Yeah. So Curtis, how can artists do that? Is it through the production of their work that's then consumed on, a larger platform? What is their role? I think that's a great way to.
Well, I'm just gonna give a shameless plug to my book then. I mean, because that's what I'm doing. I'm writing this memoir called "Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant," and it's about growing up Asian in a Black and white city and coming out in a working class immigrant community, and in the 80s. And something I hate to admit, but I used to be a Republican back then, so and so the book that I'm writing about talks about a very interesting time period in Americans, history, but it's hopefully done in a humorous way and done, I talk about serious subjects because that's who I am, but it's also done with a lot of humor and warm family moments. And so as I pitched with my agent, it's like, come for the Chinese food, but stay for the talk on racism, and maybe there are spaces that we as artists, we can create books and films and things that bring people together to watch it, but talk about these very important issues in a way that doesn't vilify or make one side feel like they're the bad guy or the other. I mean, yes, that in some ways as a progressive, that means that I have to bite my tongue a little bit, from the crazy out there. But if that's what it takes, then that's what we have to do as artists, is how to negotiate and navigate that space and create those forms for people to have these discussions. I think that's what we can do. We can imagine what that new America would look like,
I think that's a beautiful way to close. Is it all right if I just express my gratitude to the both of you and to everyone in the audience, but especially to Bino and to Curtis for sharing their insights today. I also wanted to give you a heads up that next month on November 17th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the Asian American Studies Center at Hunter College is going to continue this theme of Asian Americans, arts, and activism. We're going to host online Professor Grace Kao, and she's going to talk about why BTS and K-pop should matter to Asian Americans. And she is the IBM Professor of Sociology and Professor of Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale. For the students that are still in the audience, Spring 22 registration is going to open soon. So just a heads up that we have terrific Asian American Studies courses. And I happen to be teaching one of them, Asian 490 Immigration Policies. Check it out, but check out all our terrific courses. Till then, stay well, everyone. Thank you so much again, Bino and Curtis, for this amazing discussion. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.